So this morning, I hope I made a wise choice. I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to speak about something I never speak about: baseball. Look, there's one thing that we all have to understand here. 26 years ago when you hired me, you had to have known that I would never speak about baseball. Because, you know, I'm a Mexican Jew. We can speak about a lot of things. But baseball's not our thing. And then I start feeling like, you know, I leave my congregation out because a lot of rabbis in the United States talk about baseball all the time. You know, they use metaphors from baseball. They talk about their favorite team. I have no favorite team. I don't care who loses and who wins. As a matter of fact, when I watch baseball, I fall asleep completely. And if the park doesn't have a kosher hot dog stand, I don't even want to go. So, why did I choose to speak about baseball if it's so dear to me? Well, you know, during this time of the year, the 2 months before the Yamim HaNoraim, I go on hunt for stories. I start reading everything that comes across me. I don't discard anything. And I came across a story that really, really captivated me. And that's the story of Jackie Robinson. And I know that for you it's not a new thing, but please indulge me, for me it's brand new. The most amazing part of the story is not the story itself, but I started to research some of it. And I found out that parts of it actually never happened. Let me back down a little bit and tell you how this started. I have a friend of mine who's a rabbi in Chicago, who is a member of his congregation, who wrote a book about the famous embrace between Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese. And when we were in Israel together in the summer, he told me about the book, which was written about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, which turned into a Wall Street Journal article. And he told me that he actually loved the book. You know, if you're looking for material for the high holidays, you should read it. I said, absolutely not reading a book about baseball. But I read the article in the Wall Street Journal, which is from 2022. And it's an incredible article. Because if you remember what happened, August of 1947, there was an incident in Crossley Field in Cincinnati when the Reds played the Brooklyn Dodgers. And it was the first time in history that a black player was going to play in Major League Baseball. And it was Jackie Robinson. And he crossed the color line in Cincinnati, which is not exactly a friendly part of the United States in those days for people who are not white. Now, according to the story, there was a tremendous tension in the stadium when Jackie actually came into the field. And I think there's a movie about this too, by the way. When he finally came into the field, people were like yelling at him. You know, instead of clapping and cheering, they were booing him and shouting racial slurs. So as the story goes, Pee Wee Reese, who was a short stop, went over and embraced him. And there's a statue in Brooklyn that depicts this very moment, that embrace. Well, here's the problem. Jonathan Ig, who's the author of that article that I told you about, went around trying to decipher how exactly it happened, because there's no footage. And he found his way to Rachel, who's the widow of Jackie Robinson, who at the time he wrote the article was 100 years old. And Rachel told him that the embrace never happened. That she was there, she was at Crossley Field, and that, as a matter of fact, she was sitting with all of the wives of the other players and nobody was talking to her, and that the embrace never happened. If it happened, it didn't happen there, it happened somewhere else where nobody saw it, but she doesn't remember it. And as a matter of fact, she gave many interviews where she said the same thing. And incredibly, the movie was made, and the embrace in the movie, and the statue's still there. And there's pages and pages written about this embrace, which really changed America. Turns out, It never happened. There's a whole book about how it never happened. Now, why was I supposed to read this book for the high holidays? That's what I really started thinking. What does Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese and the embrace that didn't happen have to do with us? And I came up with an interesting understanding of the whole thing, which is about the way we tell the stories that we live through and the way we tell the stories of our own lives. If you think about it, every single one of us is a storyteller. Every single one of us. You may be good at sharing the stories out loud or not, but the way you live your life and the way you do things, you're always telling the story of something, and ultimately, the story of your own life. There are hundreds of examples in American history, in world history, of course, of things that we think happened that never happened or didn't happen that way. Need I to remind you of Washington cutting down the cherry tree? Or Plymouth Rock? And I have a story about Plymouth Rock myself. When I was in rabbinical school, Lisa and I decided we had spent too many days in New York and we needed to see something that was not Manhattan. She's laughing already. We rented a car and we were going to go to Salem, Massachusetts. It was actually the weekend of the 31st of October. You know, like they say in Hebrew, im kvar as kvar. If you're here, you're here. So we had never experienced this. And there was no GPS. It was 1991. I mean, I'm sure there was GPS, but we didn't have one. And certainly only airplanes had a GPS. So we rent a car. We couldn't afford Hertz, so we went to Rent-A-Wreck. And we rented a car. And they still have that company in New York City, by the way, Rent-A-Wreck. So we get in the Rent-A-Wreck car rental, and we start driving. Lee says, do you know where you're going? Of course. I said, of course I know where I'm going. You just have to go north. If you go north, you get to Massachusetts. Well, we made it to about 50 miles from Montreal. This is a true story. I kept looking for Route 9A, and it never crossed my path. Like, we just kept going north to Montreal. I said, don't worry, it's close to Massachusetts. We'll make a turn and we'll be there. We had to turn around. To make a long story short, we made it to Salem like at 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning. I have to tell you, there were no witches there. There was nothing but tremendous cold. And the next morning, we went to Plymouth. And we went to see Plymouth Rock. Boy, was I disappointed. This is Plymouth Rock. In Mexico, we have pyramids. And I have to look at this rock. But that's the nature of stories. That's the nature of stories. They make our lives what we want them to be. Think about it for a second. How many times in our lives have we told ourselves, I am the smartest, the most handsome, the best. I am the best. Those people that won't win the Nobel Prizes, they're all idiots. We don't say it out loud, but trust me, we think about it. And if you don't think about it, your mother did think about it. Your mother's a Jewish mother, and you were the best that was ever born. These are the stories and how we envision the world. We see the world many times not the way it really is, but the way we perceive ourselves being part of that world. Now, it's incredible because throughout those interviews of Rachel, she actually said one thing, that the wives of the other players only started accepting her when they saw that Jackie Robinson's playing the game for the Dodgers was actually of tremendous financial gain to them. So you see, that's also how our lives change. Our story changes when circumstances change. And then we kind of like reset ourselves and say to ourselves, well, this is not really the way it was supposed to be. Maybe I'm telling the story wrong. I'm going to do it in a different way. I always wanted to live in Coronado, but I find myself in Las Vegas. It's not so bad. It's not so bad. That's the way stories work. And if you think about it, biblical stories and sacred stories that actually give some kind of compass to our lives are the worst kind of stories. The story of Abraham this morning, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. The second Aliyah ends by Elchu Shnehem Yachdav, and they both went together. And I envision Abraham and Isaac holding hands, climbing that mountain. And the Midrash says, Zel ishchot, zel ishachet. This one to be slaughtered and the other one to slaughter. So each one of them was living a different reality even though they were together. And many of these stories are really difficult stories to understand. How do we tell the story of Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, a man filled with faith? Well, he was kind of a little crazy. If God tells you to go and sacrifice your son, will you do it? That is not blind faith, that's fanaticism. But we don't tell the story that way. We color the story the way we want to hear it. And I don't fault us, because that's the nature of the world. And that's the nature of our lives. And sometimes, it's not so bad when we do that, because it's the only way we can escape reality and oppression. I have a friend that keeps reminding me that people's perception of themselves is a reality. It's perhaps the most true statement ever made. You can argue with someone about whatever you want. You can argue 2 + 2 is 4. But if they're convinced that it's 5, you will never win that argument. Their perception of reality becomes reality. And by the way, this is one of the things that imprisons us as human beings. Think about our personal lives. Think about what I just mentioned about Isaac and Abraham. Each one holding hands with their own story. Our spouses and us, our partners, our children. We're all together. We live in that great pressure cooker that we call home. But we all have our own story. And we all see reality in a different way. Today, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the real hard work to returning to God begins. We have little less than 10 days to try to understand our reality and what it's really like. A person that I know came up to me yesterday night and said to me something incredible. I am back. I was away, but I'm back. And I knew in that moment that he understood his reality. It was incredible. But to actually take that step, to realize that you've been missing, to realize that you haven't been there, to realize that you haven't done, takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of, it's like being in your pajamas all day. Nobody wants to get dressed. Remember COVID? It was the best. I mean, aside from the obvious, right? But you got to stay in pajamas all day. You went on the Zoom calls, you would be wearing your underwear. It was amazing. Getting out of your pajamas takes a lot of work. Getting out of that reality takes a lot of work. And the only way we can seek forgiveness and forgive others is by being real. Because remember, for everything that happens in life, for everything I do to you or you do to me, we all have our own perception of that moment. For me, it's one thing. For you, it's completely a different thing. So I want us to engage in a little exercise before Yom Kippur falls upon us. And by the way, this may help us feel the weight of Yom Kippur on our shoulders. If you sit with someone with whom an incident happened, it could be a sibling, it could be a friend, it could be your spouse, and you've never talked about what happened, understand that they have a whole different perspective than you. And it's super hard, because you're going to hear things about the story that you don't like. That book about Jackie Robinson, it's a very difficult book because it tells Americans they're not as nice as they thought they were. It makes us confront the reality of our country, which still haunts us till today. And nobody wants to do that. So take that to your own life and go to that person and listen to their story the way they tell it. And then you tell your story the way you understand it. And maybe, just maybe, you will meet halfway. And Yom Kippur will mean something. And the words that should be spoken will be spoken. Let me tell you what happens at the end of the Akedah, which is what's not written in the Torah. Because, by the way, this is what we should be reading today from the Torah. Not the Akedah, but the aftermath. So Isaac, what happens to Isaac? By the time Abraham looks up and the angel distracts him, now there's a ram. By the way, the reason why we sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is because the ram is caught by the horn to the thicket, to the bushes. It's a very strong tradition, as you can see. By the time he notices all this, Isaac is not mentioned again in the Torah in that text until a later on Torah portion. Isaac doesn't go back from the mountain. Remember, there were the two lads, the two servants that were with Abraham that were actually telling Abraham, let us go with you. And Abraham says, no. The boy and I will go by ourselves. You don't need to go. Because they also had a different version of the story, by the way. And he comes down and it's only him. Isaac can never speak to his father again. He runs away. He understands the story in a completely different way than Abraham. I mean, do you blame him? And look at what happens to Sarah, the next Torah portion, Chayei Sarah, which comes after Vayera, which is what we read today. She dies. I've said this many times. I picture Jack Nicholson playing the role of Abraham, knocking on Sarah's door after the Akedah saying, honey, I'm home. And she just faints and dies of heartbreak because her son, the one she couldn't give birth to, that was so hard to give birth to, is completely gone forever. And that's her story. She can't live without him. That's why it's important to read these stories. And sometimes what is not written is more important than what's written. Sometimes what happened that led to that statue of the embrace is more important than the statue itself. The statue is there in Brooklyn perhaps to remind us that the only thing embraced has happened is not when we think we want to make up the embrace in our minds, but when we really struggle and toil to make sure that the day comes when we can tell the same story and embrace one another. May this be the year, dear friends, that we stop drinking our own Kool-Aid, like they say. May this be the year when we see other people's stories, and in their stories, we see ourselves. Shana Tova umetuka. Let us please rise. We're going to continue on page 123 with the Chatzi Kaddish for Musaf.